The wind carried more than dust across the valley that day. It carried judgment. They spat savage at him, a man in chains, condemned before anyone dared hear his story. And they whispered about her, a widow too stubborn to bend, too bold, to walk away. When she risked everything to shelter him, the whole valley watched, waiting for ruin. But what began in scorn turned to survival, then to something deeper. For in fire and trial, they would find not only the strength to stand against greed and hatred, but the chance to build a family no one believed possible. The sun fell heavy on a town that had already made up its mind. Dust hung in the air like judgment itself, swirling in the late afternoon light that burned down on the square. It wasn't much of a square, just a trampled stretch between the saloon, the general store, and the courthouse. But it had gathered nearly every soul from the valley. Men with leathered faces and sweat-stained hats leaned on fence rails. Women in calico dresses stood stiff on the edges, and children clutched their mothers' skirts with wide, wary eyes. At the center stood the condemned man. His hands were bound in rough iron shackles. His dark hair was matted with dust and sweat. His bare feet were blistered from miles of forced march. The word spat at him again and again, savage, seemed to stick to his skin like tar, as if the people's scorn carried weight enough to crush him before any rope or bullet ever could. Sheriff Galloway adjusted his badge, his jaw tight with self-importance. "This man is guilty of trespass, theft, and worse," he declared. Words rolled out, practiced, and heavy. The crowd murmured approval, though none had proof. In their minds, the trial was already finished. The verdict etched in prejudice before he'd even been dragged into town. But near the edge of the square, one figure stood apart. Eleanor Wade, widow of 2 harsh winters and the dying cattle plague that had taken her husband, held herself with quiet resolve. She wore a plain dress faded from years of sun, her hands roughened by work few thought a woman should do alone. Yet her eyes, clear, steady, and unflinching, rested on the prisoner. She saw not a savage, but a man beaten down, cornered by a world too quick to hate. The townsfolk whispered about her too. A widow with land worth more than her upkeep, clinging stubbornly to her small homestead when she could have sold it off and left. Some said grief had made her hard, others said she was simply foolish, but all agreed. Eleanor Wade carried herself, with a boldness that made folks uneasy. When the sheriff called for silence and raised his hand to deliver judgment, the prisoner lifted his head. His eyes, dark, fierce but tired, met Eleanor's across the crowd. For a heartbeat the world seemed to still. It was not defiance she saw there, nor surrender. It was something else, something that sparked against the flint of her own loneliness. "Let the council decide," Sheriff Galloway barked, "and let the people witness justice." But Eleanor's voice rang out, steady as iron. "Justice," she said. The word carried through the square, cutting clean through the mutterings. "You call this justice? Shackling. A man you know nothing about, condemning him because he is not like you." Heads turned. Gasps rippled. No one had expected her to speak, let alone stand against the sheriff in his own square. Galloway narrowed his eyes. "Mrs. Wade," he said, his tone sliding toward warning, "this is not your concern." But Eleanor stepped forward. Each stride sent whispers fluttering like startled birds. She stopped only a few feet from the bound man. Dust swirled around her boots as if the earth itself hesitated to touch her resolve. "It is my concern," she said, "because I will take him." The silence that followed was heavier than the sun. A widow claiming a prisoner, a so-called savage, before the whole town. It was unthinkable. "You'll what?" the sheriff demanded. "I'll take him," Eleanor repeated, her voice rising with conviction. "He'll work for me, on my land. If there's debt to pay, let him pay it there. And if you call him dangerous, let me be the fool who risks it." Gasps burst from the crowd. A woman covered her child's ears. Men muttered that she'd lost her senses. The sheriff's lips twisted into something between anger and disbelief. "Eleanor Wade, you dare take in this man? She cut him off. "This man has a name, though none of you cared to ask. And if I don't act now, he'll hang before the truth is ever known." Her words rang with a sharpness that made even those hardened ranchers glance away. The prisoner's eyes flickered, something shifting behind them, a fragile ember of hope long smothered. The sheriff scoffed. "And what do you offer, Widow Wade? What stake do you claim?" She squared her shoulders. "I offer the only thing you'll listen to, my land. If he runs, if he fails, if he harms a soul, you may take it." The murmurs surged like a wave. Her land. That homestead on the valley's edge was worth nearly everything she had left. To wager it on a stranger, on a man condemned by prejudice, was madness to them. But she stood firm. And in that moment, it wasn't just her land at stake. It was her dignity, her defiance, her refusal to bow to a world ruled by fear. The sheriff studied her, weighing the spectacle. His badge glinted, but behind his eyes was something else, greed. He'd long coveted her land, knowing she could not hold it alone. And now she'd given him the bait he'd been waiting for. "Very well," he said slowly, his voice thick with satisfaction. "The man is yours. But remember, Widow Wade, you've wagered more than you know." The crowd erupted in disbelief, outrage, and fascination. Eleanor turned toward the prisoner, her gaze steady. "You walk free of their rope," she said softly. "Just for him. But you'll walk with me now." The man nodded once. Not gratitude, not submission, something more complicated, something unspoken. And as Eleanor Wade led him out of the square, the valley buzzed with whispers. Whispers that would grow into storms. Whispers that would test her courage, his resolve, and the very ground they stood on. For in that moment, one widow's bold choice had already begun to shake the valley. Morning broke cold, and nothing between them felt certain. The first night he spent under Eleanor Wade's roof was no better than a truce. She had not taken him into her home, not fully, only to the old bunkhouse that sat 30 paces behind her cabin. Once, it had held ranch hands during harvest drives, back when her husband lived, and neighbors lent strong arms. Now, it stood empty, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, its floor swept clean but lonely. She unlocked his chains herself, though she kept a rifle within reach. The iron clattered to the floor, leaving raw bands around his wrists. He rubbed them silently, his face unreadable. "I don't know your name," she said finally, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. The man looked at her, neither defiant nor submissive. "Tahu," he answered simply, his voice low but steady. The syllables were sharp and strange on her tongue, but she repeated them quietly, as if anchoring herself to it. "Tahu," she said. "You'll work here. There's no room for idleness. You'll help mend the fence, haul water, and tend stock, and you'll keep to yourself." He nodded once. Nothing more. The first days were wordless labor. He rose at dawn and worked until the light failed, his movements precise and strong. He mended the collapsed section of corral faster than she expected, cut firewood with a rhythm that echoed through the valley, and hauled buckets from the well as though he'd done it 1,000 times. She watched from a distance, her rifle always near, though she found herself lowering it more often as the hours passed. The neighbors, of course, wasted no time. On the third day, Mrs. Hanley came by under the guise of trading eggs. Her sharp eyes scanned the yard until they landed on him. Tahu carried a bundle of fence posts across his shoulders, his muscles taut, sweat shining in the noon sun. Mrs. Hanley sniffed. "You've taken in a wolf and called it a dog, Eleanor. Don't be surprised when it bites." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "He works harder than most men I've hired," she said evenly. "And yet, no one else would touch him with A 10-foot pole. Mrs. Hanley handed over her eggs. You'll see. The sheriff will be back to collect that land of yours sooner than you think. When she left, Eleanor stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the horizon. She knew whispers spread quicker than fire in tall grass. She could feel them pressing in already. That evening, as she carried supper to the bunkhouse, cornbread and beans, plain but filling, she found him seated by the small fire he'd built. He didn't look up when she approached, but when she set the plate before him, his eyes lifted just long enough to meet hers. You shouldn't, he said quietly. She frowned. Shouldn't what? Bring me food. They will say you serve me. They already say worse, she replied, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. And I've little patience for gossip. Something flickered in his eyes, almost a smile, though it vanished as quickly as it came. He ate without complaint, and she stood there longer than she meant to, watching him eat like a man who had known too many hungry nights. The days settled into rhythm, though not peace. He repaired the barn roof, climbing with the sure-footedness of a man raised to balance on rock and tree. She tilled the garden patch, her hands blistering against the hoe. From a distance, they looked almost like any pair of workers bent to survival. But beneath the surface, mistrust lingered. At night, Eleanor would sit by her hearth, the house empty save for the ticking clock and the faint creak of the wind outside. She could hear him sometimes in the bunkhouse, soft movements, the murmur of low songs in a language she did not know. The sound unsettled her, yet it also reminded her she was no longer entirely alone. One evening, when a storm swept in from the mountains, the wind howled so fiercely it rattled every shutter on the cabin. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder rolled like cannon fire. Eleanor stepped onto the porch to check the stock and saw Tahu already there, driving the cattle into the lee of the barn. The rain plastered his hair to his face, and lightning threw his figure into sharp relief. For the first time, she felt the pull of something beyond fear or duty, a recognition of strength, of shared burden. When the storm passed, she found him standing at the fence, watching the horizon. She approached slowly. You didn't have to, she said. He glanced at her. Storm takes what it can. If you do nothing, it takes more. She studied him in the silver wash of moonlight. You speak like a man who's lost much. He did not answer. His silence was heavier than words. The next morning, Eleanor found the corral gate mended, though she had never asked. The post was carved with a mark she didn't understand, some pattern, perhaps from his people. For a moment, her hand lingered over the grooves, and she wondered what it meant. Slowly, grudgingly, trust began to take root. It was fragile, as thin as the green shoots that pressed through spring soil, but it was there, and the valley, watching from the edges, did not miss. Trouble does not always ride in with guns. It often walks in whispers. By the second week, the valley was buzzing louder than the cicadas that sang at dusk. Every fence post Tahu mended, every log he split, every step he took across Eleanor. Wade's yard was tallied and judged in hushed voices at the mercantile, in pews at Sunday service, over whiskey glasses at the saloon. Some said she was bewitched. Some claimed she'd grown desperate enough to take a savage as hired hand, or, worse, as company. Others muttered about her land, that she was throwing it away into the hands of a man who would surely betray her. Eleanor knew the talk. She felt it in the way eyes cut sharply at her when she stepped into town for supplies. She heard it in the tightening silence when she passed neighbors on the road. Yet she walked steadily, her chin lifted. If she faltered, they'd eat her, alive. At the blacksmith's one afternoon, she overheard two men muttering while Tahu stood outside waiting. Look at him, one said, his voice dripping with disdain. Walking free, as though he's earned the right. Sheriff should have strung him up then and there, the other replied. Widow Wade'll regret it, and we'll be the ones to clean up the mess. When Eleanor stepped outside, She found Tahu standing near the hitch rail, his posture rigid. He had heard every word. His gaze shifted to hers, dark with something she couldn't quite name. Anger, shame, or simply weariness at bearing the weight of their scorn. That night, as she placed his meal by the bunkhouse fire, she lingered. "You hear them," she said quietly. He nodded once. "And you say nothing?" His eyes lifted to hers. Words do not change their ears. The simplicity of it struck her harder than she expected. She wanted to defend him, to shout down the voices that smeared his name, but he carried their hatred like an old cloak, familiar, heavy, but not new. The true test came days later, when Sheriff Galloway rode up to her homestead with 3 deputies. At his side, the sound of their hooves cut through the still air, stirring dust from the dry road. Eleanor stood on her porch as they dismounted, her rifle within arm's reach, though she did not yet touch it. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wade," the sheriff drawled, tipping his hat. His eyes, sharp and cold, slid toward Tahu, who was repairing the corral. "I see you've put your investment to work." Eleanor held his gaze. "He's done more for this place in 2 weeks than most would in 2 months. The sheriff hummed, his lips curving in mock approval. "Be careful. Hard work does not change blood, and his blood runs wild," she bristled. "I don't judge a man by the lies told of him." The sheriff's smile thinned. "Your land is valuable, Eleanor. You're one mistake away from losing it. I'd hate to see you throw it away over a charity case." Her heart pounded, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "This is my land, Sheriff. My choice. You've no right to meddle in either." The sheriff studied her a moment, then turned to Tahu. "And you. Step forward." Tahu did, his shoulders squared. He met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "You belong to her now," Galloway sneered. "Don't think for a moment that means you belong here. One step out of line, and you'll find a rope waiting." Tahu said nothing. His silence, unbent, seemed to irritate the sheriff more than any words could. When they finally rode away, Eleanor felt her knees weaken. She gripped the porch rail until the tremor passed. Tahu stood nearby, calm, steady, unshaken. "They'll not stop," he said quietly. "I know," she answered. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Eleanor worked beside him in the garden patch. For the first time, she asked him something beyond orders. "What did you leave behind?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He was silent for a long moment. Finally he said, "A brother, a river, a fire I could not put out." The words hung between them, heavy and unfinished. She didn't press him, though her heart ached with curiosity. Instead, she passed him a bucket of water, and he took it without a word. The days turned to a fragile routine again, but the tension lingered like storm clouds. Neighbors watched closely. The sheriff circled like a hawk, and Eleanor felt the valley's breath holding, waiting for her to stumble. It came to a head when young Clara Hanley, the blacksmith's daughter, wandered too close to the creek one afternoon. Eleanor and Tahu were mending the fence nearby when they heard the cry. Clara had slipped on the wet bank, her skirts dragging her down, the water pulling her fast. Eleanor gasped, frozen, but Tahu was already moving. He leapt into the current, the water striking him hard, but his arms cut through with strength and certainty. He caught Clara and hauled her to shore, coughing and sputtering, but alive. The child clung to him, trembling. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor saw it, his gentleness, his instinct to protect. He wrapped the girl in his coat, carried her back to town, and placed her in her mother's arms. The crowd that gathered looked on in stunned silence. For once their eyes softened, not with acceptance, not yet, but with something that cracked the wall of scorn. That night, as Eleanor lit the lamp in her cabin, She realized something had shifted. The valley could not unsee what they had witnessed, and perhaps neither could she. But storms, she knew, do not pass so easily. Night often tells truths the daylight dares not carry. The rescue at the creek lingered like a bruise across the valley. Whispers no longer carried only malice. Some now carried doubt. A child saved, a life spared. These things could not be brushed aside. Yet others stiffened all the more, unwilling to let their hatred bend. Eleanor felt the difference most keenly in her own heart. She had seen Tahu move without hesitation, throwing himself into danger for a child not his own. That image stayed with her, replaying as she lay awake by the low crackle of her hearth. For the first time, she wondered if she had not just gambled on a man's survival, but on her own heart. The nights stretched long, and one evening, unable to keep her thoughts. From circling, she carried a lantern down to the bunkhouse. Rain pattered softly on the roof, and inside, she found him whittling by the firelight. His hands, scarred and strong, shaped a piece of wood with surprising care. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet. Tahu glanced, up, then back to the wood. "A horse, for the girl, Clara," Eleanor said. He nodded. "She will not forget the water, but maybe she will remember something else too." Eleanor stepped closer. The carving was rough, but the form was clear. A small horse, its head bowed as if drinking. She felt a tug deep inside, an ache she had not allowed in years. "You've done this before," she murmured. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, she thought he would turn away. But instead, he set down the knife. "My brother," he said quietly. "He carved. He taught me." She sat on the bench opposite him, the lantern light flickering between them. "What happened to him?" Tahu's gaze drifted to the flames. "Taken, years ago. Soldiers came. Said we must leave the river, leave the graves. My brother fought. He did not come back." The weight of it pressed heavily. Eleanor swallowed, her throat tight. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt too small against the depth of his loss. He shrugged, though it was no gesture of indifference. "The river still runs. I carry him when I carve." Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but raw. For the first time, Eleanor felt the wall between them crack. He was not just a man marked by the valley's scorn. He was a man with a story, with grief as sharp as her own. Later that week, the valley tested them again. At Sunday service, Eleanor sat alone in her pew. Heads turned as she entered, whispers fluttering like moths against the rafters. She ignored them, her hands clasped tight, her eyes fixed on the pulpit. When service ended, she stepped into the sunlight and found Tahu waiting by the hitch rail, the small wooden horse in his hand. Clara Hanley spotted it and gasped, her eyes wide with delight. She ran to him, snatched the toy and clutched it tight. "Thank you," she cried, her voice ringing clear. The crowd watched, frozen. Mrs. Hanley looked torn between gratitude and fear, but the sight of her daughter's joy could not be denied. Tahu bowed his head slightly, then turned back toward Eleanor's wagon. The murmurs that followed were not as sharp as before. That evening, Eleanor found herself speaking words she had not planned. "The sheriff," she said as they worked side by side repairing the barn door. "He won't let this rest. You know that." Tahu drove a nail in deep before answering. "He wants what you have. Land. Power. He will come again." She studied him in the fading light. "Then why stay? You could run. No one would blame you." His hammer stilled. Slowly he turned to her. "I gave my word. You risked your home. For me. If I leave, you lose everything." The sincerity in his voice struck her harder than any threat. For years she had borne her burdens alone, never trusting another to shoulder even an ounce. And now this man, this supposed savage, stood ready to carry what others would only take. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at her edges. "They'll never accept you," she whispered. He met her gaze, steady, unflinching. "I do not need them. I only need to keep my word." The blunt truth of it unraveled something inside her. She turned away quickly, hiding the heat in her eyes. That night, as the wind sighed through the eaves, Eleanor sat at her table with her husband's old journal open before her. She traced the faded ink, words written by a man now buried in the eye. Hard earth. He had always spoken of loyalty, of standing firm even when storms pressed close. She closed the journal with trembling hands. For the first time, she wondered if her late husband would have seen the same thing in Tahu that she now did. Not a threat, not a stranger, but a man of honor. And with that thought, Eleanor Wade felt the axis of her world shift. Some storms do not break with thunder, they break with men's greed. Summer had barely begun, but tension lay as thick as August heat. The sheriff's visits grew more frequent, his words sharpened, and each time he rode away, Eleanor felt the ground beneath her shift a little closer to collapse. It began with papers. He brought them one late afternoon, the ink still fresh, his deputies smirking as he held them out. "Claim's been filed," he said. "Says your hired hand here isn't free at all. Belongs to a rancher south of the river, a man named Farnell. Got his mark right there on the page." Eleanor's stomach turned cold. She scanned the papers, her heart hammering. Farnell was no stranger. Wealthy, cruel in the way only a man with too much power could be. If he had set his sights on Tahu, it wasn't justice he sought. It was leverage. "This is forged," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. The sheriff shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But a judge will have his say, and if it holds, that man there goes back in chains. You keep your wager, you lose your land. Either way, Mrs. Wade, the clock's ticking." He tipped his hat, smug, and rode away. Dust curled after him like the tail of a rattlesnake. Tahu stood silent, the chains of memory heavy in his posture. Eleanor wanted to tear the papers in half, to burn them in the fire, but she knew fire wouldn't burn away the law, not when men like Farnell and Galloway bent it to their will. That night, she found herself pacing the cabin floor, her candle burning low. Tahu watched from the doorway, his shadow stretched long across the boards. "You knew this would come," he said quietly. "I hoped it wouldn't." Her voice cracked. "I thought if we just worked, just kept our heads down, they'd leave, us be." His eyes softened, though his face remained hard. "They will not leave you be. Not for land this rich, not for a widow standing alone." She met his gaze, and for a moment her resolve wavered, but she forced herself upright. "Then we'll fight. If Farnell wants the land, if the sheriff wants his rope, let them come. They'll not take it without a storm." The days that followed pressed harder. Neighbors stopped coming by. At the Mercantile, Mr. Hanley avoided her eyes. Clara still smiled shyly at Tahu, clutching her wooden horse, but her mother pulled her away, muttering under her breath. The line between gratitude and fear had snapped, and fear won. One evening, Eleanor walked the pasture with Tahu. The sun bled low, painting the grass in firelight. "If this claim holds," she said, her throat dry, "they'll drag you back. And if you resist, they'll kill you." He was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "Then we must show them the truth before they come." "What truth?" she asked. "That I am more than what they call me. That I stand with you." His voice carried a weight that silenced the evening birds. She wanted to believe, but fear gnawed at her. Still, when she looked at him, scarred, steady and unbroken, she felt a flicker of something deeper than defiance. The breaking point came with fire. It was Clara again. This time in the barn her father had left unattended with a lamp burning too close to the hay. By the time the alarm spread, flames roared skyward, smoke billowing black against the stars. Eleanor heard the shouts from her porch. Without hesitation, Tahu ran toward the blaze. Eleanor followed, heart pounding. At the barn, men milled helplessly, shouting orders, forming bucket lines too slow to matter. Clara's cries pierced the night from inside the inferno. Tahu didn't pause. He wrapped his hands in wet burlap, shouldered through the smoke, and vanished into the fire. The seconds stretched into eternity. Eleanor clutched the fence rail, her knuckles white. Then, through the flames, he emerged, Clara clinging to his neck, her face streaked with soot but alive. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For once, no one called him savage. They called his name instead, Tahu, though only because Clara sobbed. It again and again as she clung to him. He set her gently into her mother's arms. His own arms bore burns, his shirt smoldering, but he stood tall, steady. The sight burned into Eleanor's heart. That night, when they returned to her homestead, Eleanor dressed his wounds by lamplight. Her hands trembled as she bound the cloth around his arms. "You could have died," she whispered. His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "Better me than the child." Her throat tightened. The distance between them, so carefully guarded, collapsed like the barn's roof. She wanted to say more, to name the thing growing between them, but the words tangled in her chest. Instead, she tied the bandage firmly and let her hand rest against his for a moment too long. He did not pull away. Outside, the valley whispered. Anew. But this time, the whispers carried something different. Respect, wonder, perhaps even shame. Yet Eleanor knew, so did he, that respect alone would not stop men like Farnell or Sheriff Galloway. No, storms do not end with fire. They gather. Strength until the breaking comes, and the breaking was near. Some battles are not fought on fields, but in the hearts of men who cannot stand another's freedom. The barnfire should have silenced the valley's scorn, but instead it sharpened the envy. Where some saw courage in Tahu's rescue, others saw danger in his growing presence. The sheriff, watching the shift in townsfolk's eyes, grew restless. And Farnell, the rancher with money and reach, saw opportunity. 2 days later, they arrived together, Farnell on a sleek bay horse, dressed in a coat finer than anyone in the valley needed, and Galloway, riding just behind, his badge catching, the sun like a warning. They came with papers again, this time stamped by a magistrate in the county seat. Eleanor met them on her porch, her rifle propped against the wall. Tahu stood nearby, quiet, but unyielding. "You've had your time, Widow Wade," Farnell said, his voice smooth as oil but twice as slick. He held up the papers like a trophy. "The law is clear. This man belongs to me. Sheriff here will see. It done." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Belongs? He is no man's property." Farnell's smile widened, predatory. "Everything in this valley belongs to someone with the means to claim it. Your land, your cattle, your—" His eyes flicked, toward Tahu. "Your little experiment in charity. All can be bought or taken." The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle. "Eleanor, don't make this hard. Hand him over and you keep your homestead. Defy the court and you lose both." Her stomach churned, but her voice was iron. "Then I'll defy." The deputies behind the sheriff shifted uneasily. Farnell's lips curled, half amusement, half promise of war. "Stubborn woman," he said. "You think one stray can hold back the tide? You'll drown with him." When they rode off, dust rising like smoke, Eleanor gripped the porch rail until her knuckles ached. Tahu stepped closer, his shadow long across the boards. "They will not stop," he said softly. "I know," she answered. That night, She sat at her table, the lamp burning low, and laid out her husband's old ledger beside the forged papers. The pages blurred with tears she had not meant to shed. For all her strength, fear gnawed at her, not for herself, but for the man who now worked beside her, bled for her, saved children in a town that spat his name. Tahu entered quietly, his movements as steady as the river he once spoke of. He placed something on the table, a carved figure, this one not a horse but a hawk with wings spread wide. "For you," he said. She touched it, tracing the careful grooves. "Why?" "Because hawks do not hide," he answered. The words pierced her. She swallowed hard. "If they come for you," he cut her off gently. "If they come, I will not run." The following days blurred with preparation. Eleanor patched fences, stocked grain, and sharpened the old tools as though they might become weapons. Tahu worked from dawn to dusk, his every movement carrying the weight of inevitability. And then, as if the valley itself had held its breath for this moment, the showdown came. At dusk, riders appeared on the horizon, more than before. Farnell, the sheriff, and half a dozen men, armed and ready. They rode hard, their dust trailing like the herald of a storm. Eleanor stood at her gate, rifle in hand. Tahu stepped to her side, unarmed but unafraid. Farnell reined in his horse, his smile cruel. "Last chance, widow. Hand him over. You've no fight left to win." The townsfolk gathered at a distance, drawn by the scent of blood in the air. Whispers rippled, some urging her to give in, others silent in grim fascination. Eleanor lifted her rifle. "This land is mine. This man is free. You'll not take either while I draw breath." Gasps rose from the crowd. Farnell's face twisted. "Then so be it." He nodded, and two men dismounted, moving toward the gate. Tahu stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "You will not touch her." The deputies hesitated, caught between the sheriff's glare and the man who stood like stone before them. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. "Sheriff," one whispered. "The town's watching." Indeed they were. And for the first time, the crowd's eyes did not burn solely with hate. Some looked uncertain. Some, even ashamed. Clara clutched her wooden horse in the arms of her mother, who stood trembling. The sheriff cursed under his breath. Farnell snarled. "Enough of this!" He drew his revolver, the steel flashing in the dying light. Eleanor raised her rifle. The valley held its breath. Gunmetal has a way of deciding what men call justice. The air in the valley square turned brittle, as though one spark might shatter it. Farnell's revolver gleamed. Eleanor's rifle never wavered, and between them stretched a silence, so sharp the crowd barely dared breathe. "Drop it, widow," Farnell growled. "This ain't your fight." Her voice cut steady through the dust. "It is now." Tahu stood at her side, empty-handed, but his presence seemed larger than the men with weapons. His stillness was not weakness, it was a warning. He watched Farnell, every muscle coiled, his gaze a hawk's fixed on prey. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Eleanor, don't do this," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. His hand twitched near his holster, caught between the law he pretended to uphold and the greed he fed beneath it. "You've done enough," Eleanor shot back. "You bring forged papers, threats, and lies. This land is mine. This man is free. You'll not steal either while I live." The crowd murmured, the tide shifting like grass in the wind. Men who had once spat the word savage now found themselves staring at Tahu with reluctant respect, remembering the barn fire the child pulled from the creek. Farnell sneered. "He's nothing, a mongrel. You risk everything for him?" Eleanor's voice did not falter. "I risk nothing I'm not willing to lose. But you, Farnell, you've already lost. Look at them." She tilted her head toward the watching crowd. They're seeing you for what you are, a thief dressed as a gentleman. The insult struck deep. Farnell's face twisted, rage boiling. He cocked the revolver. In the same breath, Tahu moved. He lunged, striking Farnell's arm as the gun fired. The shot cracked the silence, echoing across the valley, the bullet flying harmlessly into the dirt. Gasps erupted. Eleanor raised her rifle, leveling it at the sheriff before he could draw. "Don't," she warned, her voice like steel. The deputies faltered, uncertain. Some lowered their weapons, glancing at the townsfolk's eyes now, fixed on them with judgment. Farnell, thrown off balance, staggered. Tahu wrenched the revolver from his grip and tossed it into the dirt. The crowd surged forward, a few men stepping between Eleanor's homestead and the intruders. "Enough!" a voice cried. It was Mr. Hanley, soot still staining his clothes, from the fire that nearly took his daughter. "I saw this man risk his life for my child. I won't stand by while you try to hang him with lies." Others muttered in agreement. The sheriff's face paled, his authority bleeding out with every word. Farnell snarled, lunging for his weapon, but Tahu stepped into his path. "No more," he said, his voice ringing with quiet power. "You want chains? Wear them yourself." He shoved Farnell back into the dust, where the rancher sprawled humiliated, his coat torn, his pride in tatters. Eleanor kept her rifle steady, her eyes sweeping the deputies. "The valley has seen enough. You draw again, and it'll be your shame." "They bury, not ours." The sheriff hesitated, then spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." "Maybe not," Eleanor said. "But it's over for today." Slowly, the men remounted. Farnell, seething, avoided the eyes of the crowd. The sheriff's badge glinted one last time before he turned his horse and rode away, the rest trailing behind. When the dust settled, the valley did not move at once. The crowd lingered, silent, their gazes shifting from Eleanor's unshaken stance to Tahu's quiet strength. The image would not fade easily. Clara broke the silence. She ran forward, clutching her wooden horse, and wrapped her arms around Tahu's waist. "Pa says you saved me twice," she whispered loud enough for all to hear. The word hung in the air, saved. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their prejudice pressing hard. Yet none spoke against it. Eleanor lowered her rifle, her arms trembling now that the danger had passed. Tahu placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement that something greater than survival had bound them. Now, the townsfolk began to disperse, and their whispers changed. Not gone, not all kind, but changed. As night fell over the valley, Eleanor sat on her porch with Tahu beside her. The lantern light flickered, shadows dancing across the yard where the confrontation had played out. "They'll be back," Shika said softly. He nodded. "Storms always return." She looked at him, the man once condemned as savage, now the one who stood between her and ruin. "Then we'll face them together." And in that quiet, beneath the stars, a truth settled deep in her chest. Whatever storms came, she no longer stood alone. Morning came not with fear, but with the sound of hammers on wood. The valley had been split open the night before. Dust and anger had risen, guns had flared, and lines had been drawn. But dawn brought something else, an ordinary rhythm of work that whispered louder than all the threats. Eleanor rose early, her hands steady as she kneaded dough at the table. Through the window, she watched Tahu in the yard, his bandaged arms swinging the hammer, setting posts upright where the gate had been broken during the standoff. Each strike carried certainty, not defiance, an act of rebuilding, of belonging. When she stepped outside with a fresh loaf cooling in her hands, the smell rising warm in the crisp air, Tahu glanced up. His eyes met hers, and in that small exchange, there was no need for words. They had faced fire and hatred together, and they had not broken. By mid-morning, neighbors began to appear. First, the Hanleys, awkward but earnest. Clara darted forward with her wooden horse, her smile unguarded. She hugged Eleanor tight, then clung to Tahu's hand. Her father, eyes shadowed by shame, cleared his throat. "I reckon I owe you more than thanks," Mr. Hanley said. "You saved her life. Twice. Whatever the sheriff calls you, to me, you're a man worth standing beside." Others came too, hesitant, wary. They brought small offerings, a sack of flour, a coil of rope, and nails for the fence. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was a beginning. The valley had seen truth with its own eyes, and even the hardest hearts could not unsee it. That night, Eleanor and Tahu sat on the porch, the stars sharp above them. She placed the hawk carving on the table between them. "You said hawks don't." "Hide," she whispered. He nodded, the firelight painting his features in bronze and shadow. "And you did not hide either." Her throat tightened. "I was afraid." "So was I," he admitted, his voice low. For a long while they sat in silence, the distance between them shrinking until it was no distance at all. When his hand found hers, calloused fingers rough against her own, it felt less like a gesture and more like a vow. Weeks passed, and the sheriff kept his distance. Farnell's threats simmered, but his influence waned under the weight of public opinion. A man humiliated before the valley was no longer the force he once was. The whispers, once sharp with scorn, softened into a strange respect, though some still clung to fear. Yet on the Wade homestead, life took root. Fences held, crops sprouted, the barn stood sound. In the evenings, laughter flickered across the yard, the sound of Clara visiting, her parents less resistant now, the sound of Tahu telling stories in quiet tones, Eleanor smiling more than she had in years. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor brought out her husband's old wedding band. She turned it over in her hands, the gold dulled with time. "I thought I'd be buried with this," she murmured. Tahu watched her, his gaze steady. "It belonged to a man who loved you. It does not bind you to ghosts." She swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes. Slowly, she slid the ring onto the chain around her neck, letting it rest close to her heart, but not on her finger. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "it's time to live again." He reached across the small space between them, his hand resting over hers. No promises spoken, no vows declared, but the firelight seemed to seal something ancient and unbreakable between them. In the weeks that followed, the valley began to change. Children waved when Tahu passed, men nodded instead, sneering, and women quieted their tongues. Not all hearts were softened, but enough were to tip the scales, and through it, all Eleanor and Tahu worked side by side. They built more than fences and barns. They built a home where suspicion had once dwelled, a bond forged in trial and tempered by fire. So it was that a widow's bold choice shook an entire valley. They spat savage at him, but in the end, they found themselves silenced by the DA. Truth of his courage, his decency, his quiet strength. And they whispered of her, once stubborn, once foolish in their eyes, but in time they would call her something else, brave. For love, in those hard frontier days, did not always come with flowers or fine words. Sometimes it came in the form of a man pulling a child from fire, a woman standing her ground against greed, two hearts choosing not to hide when storms bore down, and that story the valley never forgot. Because on the harsh edge of the frontier, it is not hatred that builds legacies. It is the courage to see beyond it, and the hope to begin again. And if this tale stirred you, if it reminded you that love and honor can outlast even the darkest storm, then don't ride off just yet. Subscribe, share this story, and join us again on the next trail where the frontier meets the heart.